Hello and welcome back to The Note. Let's talk about the oil markets today. A few years ago when the crude price was spiking, it was very popular to talk about peak oil, the notion that the supply of oil had peaked and would steadily decline, meaning rising prices from then on. Now, perhaps it makes more sense to talk about peak demand or maybe peak car, that the usage of oil, the demand for oil, might be at a peak and steadily declining from here on in. That, at least I believe, is the argument of my guest today. He's the visiting professor from King's College London and FT blogger Nick Butler. Nick, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Let's start by taking a look at this very intriguing graph which shows European total petroleum consumption. It's very startling in that apparently the continent of Europe is only using as much petrol now as it was doing some 25 years ago. What are the factors driving this kind of driving that kind of a trend?
I think the number, firstly, clearly the recession and the downturn in the European economy over the last few years has had some impact, but
yes,
that's not the only factor. Cars are much more efficient. Right. There's been great investment in public transport systems, and people are just not driving as much as they used to. And that's true right across the developed world.
Okay, so in general, the economy is less oil intensive than it used to be.
That's right. I think the forecasts you quoted at the beginning left one thing out, which is that economies change, not least in response to prices, but also in response to technology. And what you've seen is oil being pushed out of many markets, just back into the transport market. But even there, technology, more efficient cars, better use of communications to avoid travel by individuals and through businesses, all that has eaten away at what was presumed to be constant growth in oil.
Okay, now let's take a look at the trend in the States. Obviously a country where the car is very central, where there are big distances to be covered. This trend, this inexorable rise in the amount of miles that Americans drove each year, started to flatten out during the crisis. People wondered whether it was a response to high prices. Right. Now, would you argue that this is the beginning of a longer-term trend again, that Americans are not going to drive so much?
That is the evidence, and there's some very good academic work from the University of Michigan which shows that people's lifestyles are changing. People are just driving less, and their work patterns have changed. And I think the congestion, I mean, you showed a picture at the beginning which is from Asia, but I think congestion in all the major cities around the world puts people off driving. And this is now beginning to see. So I think we are in the US and Europe at peak car. We're not at peak car on a global basis yet, but I think we are getting there. And that will have a profound effect.
Now, how quickly are you prepared to predict that we will get to peak car globally? Are we talking within a decade?
I think 2025, 2030 for peak car numbers, but for peak oil use, I think because of efficiencies and substitution away from oil, for instance in the US, substitution to biofuels, right, I think you'll see peak oil worldwide by 2020.
Wow, that's quite a prediction. Now let's get back to the supply of oil with which we started. Yeah. We've obviously had a big increase in supply coming from the exploitation of shale.
Yes.
Is there anything still to be said for the notion of a peak in supply?
Not much. I think the shale gas and tight oil revolution in the US is just beginning. I think if you go through, read the FT almost day by day, you see people looking for tight oil. The next up is Russia, which clearly has quite a lot of resources. I think you'll see tight oil, that is oil from shale rock, developed in many countries around the world, and that will increase supply still further. There's also technology advancing, which is getting people into deep water and quite safely into deep water, and I think that the oceans of the world have really not been explored yet, and that's the next step we'll see.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's not often that we manage to be very positive on these videos, but I think we've managed it today. It does look as though the world is going to be able to conserve those resources of oil in such a way that we're not going to get the kind of really alarming energy crisis that many people were talking about only about 5 years ago. That being said, I suppose it's not the greatest of news if you were betting on oil or running a large oil company.